real parents, real stories. It's the Meet the Parents podcast.
Welcome to episode 54 of the Meet the Parents podcast, which unusually for us is coming to you on a Wednesday. Normally we record on a Sunday or a Monday and we publish on the following Friday, so we don't usually hurry to comment on current events as they happen. Indeed, Hannah, Mark and I recorded the original episode 54 last night when we talked about the recent male online attack on mummy bloggers and slummy mummies. That episode will now be released next week instead. About an hour after we finished recording last night, news started to filter through about a suspected explosion at the Manchester Arena, where a concert by the American pop star Ariana Grande had just finished. A singer with a large teen and preteen fan base. Many of us would have gone to bed hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. And we woke up to the news that a suicide bomber had walked into the foyer of the venue just as people were starting to leave and triggered a homemade explosive device. At the latest count, 22 people had died, with a further 59 injured and several adults and children still unaccounted for. Unattended kids were evacuated to local hotels, not knowing where their friends and parents were, and a massive police operation was initiated. So, in the wake of all this, Hannah, Mark and I are back again tonight to capture our thoughts as parents 24 hours after the attack. Hannah and I, in fact, were both in Manchester over the weekend, and to say that all three of us are still in something of a state of shock is an understatement. I think the scars of the Westminster attack just a few weeks ago are still a little too fresh for us, as I'm sure they are for many of you. So, Hannah, Mark, insofar that we consider it to be good, good evening.
Hi.
Let's begin at the beginning. It was around 10:30 last night when news of an incident at the Manchester Arena began to spread across social media, with the usual conflicting reports from those who were there, those who claimed they were there, and those claiming to be in the know with absolutely no basis in fact. So, Hannah, as a parent of two younger children, what's your reaction? How did the events of last night make you feel with regards to the world you're bringing them up in and how you approach it?
I first read the news at 5:30 odd this morning, and both kids decided I needed an early wake-up call, and so in typical parent fashion you're sort of muttering under your breath as you stumble bleary-eyed and decide which one needs tending to first, and then you read these headlines and that just pales into insignificance. I immediately burst into tears. I'm an emotional person. I wear my heart on my sleeve, and I'm not ashamed to say I've cried on and off the whole day. I'm absolutely devastated by it. I think of all the things that have happened in recent years, this one's hit me the hardest because it just feels worse because it's so targeted at children and youngsters, and that's just horrendous. I mean, I don't feel scared to be raising my children in this world. I think overall we do live in a fairly safe time. I think social media can sometimes make it feel that it's unsafe because we hear about everything instead of, decades ago or, generations ago where only small amounts of news filtered through. So I don't feel scared about the world that I'm bringing them up in. I just feel like because everything is so accessible, because the news is constant, it's really important to show them the good in the world, but also to teach them how to be as safe as they possibly can. And I mean, mine are still only just 1 and not quite 3. So I haven't really got to deal with that yet, but obviously it's on my mind an awful lot. And I don't want them to be scared. I want them to see all the amazing things that the world has, but I need them to know how to try and keep as safe as possible. And if either of you more established parents have any tips for me on how to go about that, then I would be very grateful for them.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the thing is always about just trying to be as open and honest with them as we can. And as you say, the fact that this was an atrocity that was targeted at an event where it was known there would be a lot of children is what really brings it home. And it does perhaps make it a little bit scarier in some ways than some of the other attacks we've seen. I mean, we know that the youngest dead victim who's been named so far was an 8-year-old girl, and that's a year younger than Isaac, a year older than Toby, and you can't help but feel affected by that. And Mark, your children are older, but they're of an age where going to concerts and other live events in public becomes a part of their day-to-day life that's not something that you can control anymore. I mean, did that make the news hit any closer to home for you?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I absolutely agree with Hannah that this one has affected me more than any of the other terrorist attacks and atrocities of recent years. And I found it strange today. Like Hannah, I didn't see this news until first thing this morning. And it was one of the sort of rare events, rare days in our married life when I woke my wife up and said, I think you ought to wake up and see the news. I've found as the day has gone on and the implications of this attack have sunk in, and something I'll talk about later on, as you consider how wide the ripples will go, I've become more and more upset, and I've found it really quite a difficult day. But yes, absolutely, Tim, to answer your question, Dan and Eleanor both go to concerts. They go to, I'm so old, I don't even know what the technical term is anymore. They go to clubs where there are DJs and things like that. 500 yards from where I'm talking to you, the Kaiser Chiefs are performing on Saturday night. Alex's girlfriend is going, and my wife's just come home and said someone at work's got a spare ticket. Do you mind if I go and see the Kaiser Chiefs on Saturday night? Well, of course I don't mind, but you don't mind with any of your children, obviously, but you do worry. In fact, my wife came in tonight and said, have you started worrying about Eleanor for Saturday? And I hadn't, but of course, I don't know if you remember a couple of podcasts back, I said that her football team had won the People's FA Cup. She's going to the cup final on Saturday. So all of a sudden, there's things you're worrying about, something which should have been a really joyous occasion, and you're watching the TV to see if you can see your daughter. Suddenly you're watching the TV in an entirely different light.
You're watching completely on edge, aren't you?
Absolutely. And I've been kind of so busy thinking about concerts and things like this, and then my wife came in and said, have you started worrying about the cup final? And I hadn't, and now I am.
I found my mind today constantly being filled with the image of a parent dropping off a child for a much anticipated evening of entertainment, and then returning later to discover people running in panic and being unable to find your own child, not knowing whether they're among the casualties, and potentially not knowing whether they're safe or even where they are. I mean, many unattended kids were taken to hotels, the injured were taken to hospital, and I can easily imagine that in the confusion and chaos, it might have taken several hours for some parents to reconnect with their kids. And as we know, some are still unaccounted for.
Absolutely. I mean, the image that sticks in my mind is when Eleanor was 12, 13, she would go out with her friends, and they'd be going to a party or something like that, and you'd have Eleanor sitting next to you in the car and three of her friends on the back seat, and and they'd be so excited, and and occasionally you'd glance in the rearview mirror and you'd catch sight of these girls, and you'd realise that your daughter was growing up, and she wasn't a little girl, she was a young adult, and it was the real sense of excitement they had and their whole life in front of them, and there must have been so many parents last night who took their own daughter or son and picked up a couple of friends on the way, and did the same as I do, just glanced in the rearview mirror as they were driving along and realised their children were growing up, and then to go back later and not be able to find them, or to find them in a hospital, or even worse. I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, to say it doesn't bear thinking about is a dreadful, trite understatement. But every parent listening to this podcast will know exactly what all three of us are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, with children aged 9, 7 and 5, the challenge is how to talk about news like this to them. They're all very different. They're at different levels of understanding and engagement with the news. And I came downstairs this morning to find the kids in a state of blissful ignorance. They were all thoroughly absorbed in an episode of Danger Mouse. And if only all real-life villains were like Baron Greenback and we had a white jumpsuited rodent and his bespectacled hamster sidekick to protect us from them. And given the short amount of time we had before I had to leave for work and they had to head off to school, we took the decision not to rush into telling them, knowing full well they would hear about it in school, and I know it was covered in their school assembly. But instead we decided to wait until evening, get our heads around the facts a bit more and work out a bit of a strategy for telling them. So, this involved taking Isaac, our oldest, to one side for a more in-depth discussion. I sat down with him and watched the vigil and tried to explain some of the facts and what was going on to him, and then dealing with Toby and Carver separately. In Carver's case, that meant not really talking about it at all. In Toby's case, that meant letting him go and play on my computer to build a PowerPoint about used cars, which is very Toby. And Toby's a challenging one because he's still affected by the death of his grandmother 4 months ago, and he's had difficulty processing his grief ever since. So I'm very conscious that we're going to have to keep an eye on him, as I'm sure, although there was no immediate reaction today, I'm sure there's going to be an impact in the future. So that's going to be an interesting one for us to watch out for. I mean, in terms of how we as parents should be talking to our kids about tragedy, a few episodes back, John, Simon and I talked about this in the context of the Westminster Bridge attack, and I highlighted some advice given by Nikki Cox, editor-in-chief of the children's newspaper First News. Now, today they've published an updated version of their 7-point guide to help kids through events such as last night's, which I think is really useful. So I'll just summarise it quickly now. So, number 1, don't cover up your feelings if you're scared. Don't worry quietly on the inside. Talk to someone, an adult love and trust. 2, there's lots of inaccurate information that ends up on the internet. Make sure you get your news from a trusted source. Things are going to get talked about in the school playground or online, and it's better that you know the real facts rather than hearing exaggerated or confused versions from other people. 3, terrorism isn't new. It goes back as far as the gunpowder plot in 1605. More recently, for 3 decades, Britain lived with the threat of bomb attacks from the IRA, but there's always a solution. In the meantime, kids will still go to school, parents will still go to work, families will still continue to go out to sporting events, to concerts, on holiday. Life goes on. And again, that sounds like a very trite thing to say, but it's true. Life doesn't stop. Number 4, events like the Manchester attack are extremely rare, although it doesn't really feel that way at the moment sometimes. But we haven't seen a big explosive attack like this in Britain since 7/7, so that was 2005. Likelihood of being caught up in an event like this is infinitesimal. So it's so small you can't calculate the probability of it. 5, the police are doing all they can to make sure that everyone's safe. there were 400 plus police officers working through the night, and thousands more are working around the clock in the background to try to stop events like this happening. 6, remember, there's more good news than bad news in the world. Again, it doesn't always feel like that happens, but it's, there is some truth in that, and that there are many more good people than bad people, and maybe we'll touch on that in a little bit. And then 7, and perhaps most importantly and relevantly of all, hug your family a little bit closer and for a little bit longer tonight. Now, I know you both have kids at opposite ends of the age spectrum, but any thoughts in response to, how we might, deal with it with children of a certain age?
I actually wrote a blog post a few months ago now about teaching Toby about the emergency services, and today we popped into town and we saw an ambulance, and I said to Toby, he pointed it out, and I said to him, can you remember what's happening when you see an ambulance? And he said to me, somebody needs some help, and the people in the ambulance are going to help them and take them to hospital, and then the doctors and the nurses will try to make them feel better. And yeah, he's not even 3 yet. I don't want to scare him, but I also think I need him to know who's out there to help him. I need him to know that if he sees an ambulance or a police car or a fire engine or, any of the emergency services, that they are there to help people, and that if he ever needed them, they would help him as well. So at such a young age, I can't go that deep into things with him, but I just need him to know that there are so many people out there who are working for his safety and for everybody's safety. And that's just, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's the way that I talk to him about things.
Yeah, and for me that's absolutely right. I think the education process has to start early. It's always important to remember that even with young kids, they often understand more than we give them credit for, and to accentuate the positives of the people who are there to help and support, I do think it's important and it's reassuring. And Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would really agree with that. We have never sought to hide bad news from our children. We have always discussed things openly with them and really said to them, there's no question you cannot ask us. Probably the first event for us was my wife's 2 closest friends were Eleanor's godmothers, and tragically both of them died of breast cancer before they reached 40. So the first time that happened, we took them with us to the funeral. We debated long and hard as to whether to take them to the funeral, and I think Eleanor would have been 4 or 5, and I think many parents would have said no. But we took the view that it was right that they should know, and that they should understand the grieving process, and that they should understand why their mum was so upset. And I always think that children understand much more than we give them credit for, and can cope with much more than we give them credit for. And on that day, the 2 of them were they were fabulous. They were just exemplary. That they understood and they played their part and they took it in, and they were upset but not too upset, and also they were a big comfort to their mother at what was a really, really difficult time for her. So my advice would always be to err on the side of telling your children too much, not too little.
Yeah, and for me, I would definitely agree with that, Mark, and and certainly what you were saying, Hannah. I think for me, it's crucial to talk to kids about all the people who will help, and all the people who did help and have helped over the last 24 hours. The first responders who rushed towards unknown danger without a second thought, the taxi drivers who turned off their meters to take people away from the venue, the cafes who offered free teas and coffees and food to the emergency services, the hundreds and thousands of generous people who answered the call to donate blood. Celebrate them, celebrate the everyday heroes. And so, were there any other feel-good stories that have given you cause to smile that you've spotted today? Mark?
Well, not a story, Tim, but a news headline, because the temperature in North Yorkshire became warm enough for us to eat outside. So the three of us, my wife and I and Alex, I cooked spaghetti carbonara. We ate out in the garden. Alex and I had a beer. So it's not a story, but it was just a lovely, feel-good family thing to do. And while we were eating, we talked about the news, and as we've always done. So that was kind of a nice normal in the middle of a really not very good day.
Yeah, remembering to enjoy life.
I am slightly concerned that my beer bill has gone up to double or treble what it used to be now that he's turned 18, but such is life.
How about you, Hannah?
I think the main thing that was I thought very comforting was about the people, really, really putting themselves out there to help, and the fact that obviously they needed an awful lot of blood and they got it. They got every drop that they needed, and I think that's just absolutely wonderful, and it shows that every single person can do something, and did. And I think that's wonderful. On a personal level, the sun was shining down here as well. And my mum and I took the kids to the park, and Toby made a friend. And it's just nice seeing him reach that age where he actually enjoys the company of other children, instead of them being an inconvenient obstacle to his route to the slides. So a bit like Mark, it's sort of picking out the nice stuff, because we are lucky. I looked around today and I thought, I have got my kids, and I have got my parents, and I have got my husband and all my friends, and there are so many people today that now haven't. And so I need to focus on the fact that I do, and it's a lovely feeling to know that I have got that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think you guys have really kind of encapsulated the things that we should remember and that we should feel good about our ordinary lives and not take them for granted. And, kind of to add to that, the other side of the coin is, I'd say, don't focus on the idiots who are posting fake photos of supposedly missing children on Twitter. The ones who offer speculation or misinformation as fact just to get a few retweets. The absolute morons using tragedy for political capital to push the Britain First agenda. The ones who talk about exporting all immigrants. Yes, export them. What are they? Boxes of Walker's crisps. And ignore the champion of the crudely reductionist opinion, Katie Hopkins. That's 2 nights in a row we've ended up talking about her, and her rallying call for a final solution that had a more than nasty echo of the Nazis' treatment of the Jews during the Holocaust. And yes, I know she changed it, claiming it was an innocent error. Pull the other one. And finally, spare a thought as well for the unseen victims. While attention focused, rightly of course, on the dead and the injured, they're not the only people who are affected by a tragedy such as this. And Mark, I know you wanted to make a point about that.
Yeah, I do, Tim, and in many ways this is the thing that's upset me it's not upset me the most, but it's the thing that's given me most pause for thought through the day, really, is that obviously your thoughts are with the victims and their parents, but the ripples of this go much wider, and that there are aunts and uncles and grandparents who must be absolutely devastated today. That there must be hundreds and thousands of school children who didn't go to this concert, but who've lost best friends, or who've seen their best friends badly injured. There are teachers who are affected. And it's all happened right in the middle of the exam season, or just as the exam season for some children is about to start. So that there are going to be schools where the whole exam process is disrupted, GCSEs and A-levels. And the more you think about it, the more the implications of it sink in. And it's just devastating for so many people on so many different levels. And as I say, that's sort of the more I've thought about it today, the ripples just go wider and wider and wider.
Yeah, and that's a really, really important point. I think there's a well-known psychological condition called survivor syndrome, where those who suffer a traumatic event can often suffer from feelings of guilt or even depression. Why did I survive when the person next to me died? What makes me any more deserving? How am I supposed to process my emotions when everyone is focusing on those who have been visibly affected, those who've lost loved ones or seen them bearing serious physical injuries that they'll have to live with for the rest of their lives. Now, we often talk about the damage of attacks such as these, but it's like seeing the tip of the iceberg. We tend to process tragedy in terms of numbers. How many people were killed? How many people were injured? How many arrests? But much of the true damage lies beneath the surface, and we don't always see or appreciate it. I think that's a really kind of nice point to tie things up on. So, on that note, I think we'd better wrap up. But before we go, I'm going to have a bit of a rant. I really hope that people will have watched this evening's vigil in Manchester's Albert Square and taken note of how people of all faiths stood together and listened to a very strong and very common message of unity and diversity. I hope they remember how many of the people who selflessly made little acts of kindness to support those in need were of different faiths. Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, all manner of people. And, I hope they take note of the way, again, that first responders put themselves potentially in harm's way without a second thought. I hope that people remember that our collective power is greater when we come together, when the likes of Islamic State and Britain First want only to see us divided to serve their own ends. And I've seen that spirit in the people of Manchester these past 24 hours, and it's that more than anything, I think, that gives me hope in the midst of adversity. So that's it for this episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, and normal service will be resumed with a slightly less depressing discussion about slummy mummies. But in the meantime, here's where you can find the three of us online. So, Hannah?
I'm at buddingsmiles.co.uk, and I'm on all social media at buddingsmiles.
And Mark?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at bestdadicanbe, and the blog is bestdadicanbe.com.
And you can find me on slouchingtowardsthatcham.com and across social media as @ThatchamDad. So thanks for listening to us tonight, and do please join us again next week. Good night.